The darkness pressed against me like a living thing, and all I could hear was the howl of wind cutting through the December night in Columbus, Ohio. My breath came in visible clouds, each one a small reminder that I was still alive, though I wasn't entirely sure why that mattered anymore. I had been standing on the porch of what used to be my house, the house I'd paid off completely, the house that held 30 years of memories, the house my late husband Robert and I had picked out together when we were young and believed the future would always be kind to us. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or from the words my daughter Sarah had just thrown at me like shattered glass. "You're old, Mom. You're in the way. We need our space." Those words would echo in my mind for months to come, but in that moment, standing outside in -20-degree cold with nothing but the clothes on my back, all I could think about was where I would go next. I had sold my only house 6 months earlier to pay off Sarah's business debts she had accumulated through poor decisions and worse partnerships with her husband Marcus, who had convinced her that investing in cryptocurrency and questionable real estate schemes was the path to financial freedom. I didn't sell that house because I was weak or foolish. I sold it because she was my daughter, because I believed in her, because somewhere deep in my chest I still thought that mothers were supposed to sacrifice for their children without keeping score. What I didn't realize was that by selling my house, I had also sold my place in her life. I had become a burden instead of a blessing, a reminder of her failure instead of a symbol of unconditional love. That night in December, as the temperature dropped further and the wind picked up speed coming off Lake Erie, I understood something fundamental about betrayal. It never comes from strangers. It comes from the people whose hands you've held, whose childhood tears you've dried, whose dreams you've made your own. I started walking down Broad Street, my thin winter coat inadequate against the brutal cold, my fingers already going numb despite the worn gloves I'd grabbed as I left. The sidewalks of Columbus were mostly empty at that hour, and the few people I passed crossed to the other side of the street. I understood their instinct. I looked like a ghost, a woman with nowhere to go and nothing left to lose. I had worked my entire life as a nurse at Mount Carmel Medical Center, 60-hour weeks helping patients through their darkest hours, treating burns victims and trauma patients with steady hands and a compassionate heart. I had saved lives, held hands of dying patients so they wouldn't feel alone, mentored young nurses who came in nervous and uncertain. Now, at 62 years old, I was the one with nowhere to turn, nobody waiting for me. Nothing to my name but the clothes on my back and a decades-old skills that suddenly felt worthless. My feet carried me toward the rail yards on the outskirts of downtown Columbus, an area I had driven past countless times but never really looked at. The abandoned boxcars sat like sleeping giants in the darkness, their rust-red paint peeling in long strips, their wheels frozen solid against tracks that hadn't seen a scheduled train in years. As I climbed into one of the boxcars, feeling the rough metal beneath my fingers and the accumulated grime of decades against my palms, I made a choice that I didn't fully understand at the time. I didn't climb into that boxcar to begin living. I climbed into it because the alternative was to stop living, and something stubborn in my chest, something shaped by my parents' sacrifice, by my late husband's dignity in the face of illness, by the countless patients I'd cared for who never gave up, something in me refused to surrender to the cold. The boxcar smelled of oil and rust, and something else I couldn't identify, something ancient and deep. The floor was littered with old wooden pallets, broken cardboard, and the detritus of transient lives. I could see my breath forming clouds in front of my face, each one slightly more desperate than the last. I began to work with the materials around me, calling upon the mechanical skills my father had taught me when I was a girl in rural Kentucky, skills he'd passed down because he believed women should know how to fix things, how to problem solve, how to look at a broken system, and figure out how to make it function again. I blocked the wind with broken pallets, layering them strategically to redirect the airflow away from where I would sleep. I found old insulation that had fallen from other cars and created a nest of sorts, a small pocket of relative warmth in the massive cold of that boxcar. By the time the first light of dawn broke across the Columbus skyline, I had transformed my tomb into something resembling shelter. It wasn't comfort, it was survival, and survival was all I could hope for anymore. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The first week in the boxcar was the hardest, not because of the physical conditions, though those were severe beyond anything I'd experienced, but because of the mental torment of understanding that I had become invisible. People walked past the rail yard, and when they noticed me, they looked through me like I was a ghost, a problem to be avoided rather than a person to be helped. Some teenagers would come by and film me on their phones, treating me like I was entertainment, posting videos with captions like, "Train lady still here," and "the homeless ghost of the yards." None of them seemed to register that I was a woman who had worked 60-hour weeks saving lives, a woman who had held the hands of strangers as they died, a woman who had given everything to her daughter only to be cast away like garbage. The cold had a way of clarifying things, though. As I spent hours each day scavenging for materials to improve my shelter, as I negotiated with the handful of other transient people who moved through the yard, as I began to understand the rhythms of this forgotten place, I realized that my old life had been a kind of death too. I had been slowly disappearing into the role of helper, into the invisible labor that wives and mothers provide, into the assumption that my value came from what I could do for others rather than from who I was. The boxcar demanded that I remember who I was beyond those roles. I was Margaret. I had hands that could fix things. I had a mind that could solve problems. I had a will to survive that seemed to grow stronger the colder it got. By the second week, the other residents of the rail yard had begun to accept me as a fixture, though still not as a person. There was Dennis, a man in his 70s who'd been living in the yards for over a decade, who had lost his legs to diabetes and frostbite and now moved through the yard on a handmade cart. There was Jasmine, a woman my age who'd left an abusive marriage in Toledo and found herself with nothing but a bus ticket and nowhere to use it. There was Marcus, not my ex-son-in-law, but a young man in his 20s who'd arrived at the yards as a summer drifter and never quite managed to leave. They began to call me Nurse Maggie, and though the nickname was born of a kind of cruel irony, it eventually became something else, a mark of recognition, an acknowledgement that I had skills worth knowing about. When Dennis's infection got serious, infected wounds on his stumps that were turning dangerously red, I used supplies I'd managed to scavenge from a dumpster behind Mount Carmel and cleaned his wounds the way I'd done for thousands of patients, with steady hands and careful attention. When Jasmine got sick with pneumonia, I recognized the signs immediately and helped her through the worst of it, monitoring her breathing, finding warm blankets, making sure she drank enough water. These small acts of healing, performed not for institutional recognition or payment but for simple human connection, reminded me that I had not lost myself. I had simply been forced to rediscover myself on terms I'd never chosen. The town of Columbus, Ohio, is a proud city of over 900,000 people, but like most cities, it has its forgotten corners. The rail yard where I had found shelter was one of them, an area that was technically still used by CSX rail lines, though infrequently, more for storage than for active transportation. The land around it was owned by someone, managed by someone, but those someones had effectively ceded it to the homeless population and the weather and time. I began to notice things about the yard that other people seemed to miss. There were subtle shifts in the boxcars themselves, a creaking in the night that suggested movement where there should be none, an unusual vibration that came through the metal floor at odd hours. One night, about 3 weeks into my residence in the yard, I woke from a thin sleep to a sound that took me back decades, the sound of locomotives warming up, a distant rumble that grew slowly louder, the distinctive hiss and clank of air brakes being tested. My nursing career had taught me to pay attention to warning signs, to notice the small things that suggested larger problems. My father had taught me to listen to machines, to understand what their sounds meant. Both of those lessons, learned in a different lifetime, suddenly became essential. I began to track the patterns, to notice when the vibrations came, to understand which cars seemed to shift and which seemed stable. I started a kind of map in my mind, visualizing the stress points, the weak junctures, the places where metal had corroded and fasteners had loosened. I realized, with a certainty that made my blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, that there was an unstable situation developing in the yard. I tried to warn people. I went to the administration office at the depot and tried to explain my concerns to a tired-looking woman named Patricia, who clearly did not want to be bothered by a homeless woman in a donated coat. I tried to catch security guards and explain my observations. I left anonymous messages. But what I was, a 62-year-old homeless woman living in an abandoned boxcar, made my warnings seem like the desperate ramblings of a disturbed mind rather than the careful observations of someone with actual expertise. It was early March when I began to understand the scope of what was happening. The boxcars in the yard were not just deteriorating randomly. There was a structural issue in the rail line itself, a gradual shift that was causing pressure on the coupling systems, creating microfractures that would eventually lead to catastrophic failure. There was also evidence of a slow gas leak from one of the older tanker cars, a leak that was not immediately visible, but that I could detect by smell and by the peculiar behavior of the rats and birds that inhabited the yard. These were not vague concerns. These were specific mechanical problems that could kill people. So I did what my father would have done. I did what any person with skills and knowledge should do when they see a disaster forming. I began to prepare. I reinforced the structure of my boxcar, making sure that it could provide shelter not just for myself, but for others if it became necessary. I identified exits and pathways through the yard that would be safe even in conditions of chaos. I gathered first aid supplies, water, blankets, anything that might be useful in an emergency. I created signals using metal and reflective materials, placing them strategically around the yard to warn away potential users from the most unstable cars. I worked quietly, not asking for permission or acknowledgement, simply doing what needed to be done because no one else would. I had spent my life serving others through the official channels of a major hospital, but service, I was learning, was service whether it was recognized or compensated or not. 2 days before it happened, I noticed the pressure building. The air seemed different, charged with potential. The ground beneath the yard vibrated with increasing frequency. I made one final attempt to warn someone, approaching a security guard named Tom who'd occasionally show me small kindnesses, a cup of coffee left by the fence, a nod of acknowledgement that treated me as human. Tom, there's going to be an accident.
Soon.
In the next few days. I said it quietly, not dramatizing, not demanding, just stating fact. He looked at me with something that might have been pity. Maggie, I hear you, but there's nothing I can do with what you're telling me. And he was right, of course. What could he do? The word of a homeless woman against the institutional weight of a rail company that had no budget for urgent repairs and no appetite for bad publicity. So I waited. And I prepared. And I lived with the knowledge that something terrible was coming, and I was one of the only people who understood what and when. March 15th, 2024, started like any other cold day in Columbus, the temperature hovering just above freezing, the sky threatening snow. I spent the morning doing what I could to finalize my preparations, testing the reinforcements I'd made, making sure that the first aid supplies were accessible, double-checking that water and blankets were in place. By mid-afternoon, I felt it again, that particular vibration that I'd come to associate with the warming up of distant locomotives. This time, though, it felt different, larger, more urgent. I made sure Dennis knew to come to my car if anything happened. I flagged down Jasmine and Marcus and told them to stay alert. I positioned myself near the entrance of my boxcar where I could see the main rail line while still being protected by the structure. And then I waited. The sound, when it came, was nothing like the movies. There were no dramatic explosions, no sudden chaos. Instead, there was a terrible grinding sound, metal against metal, the shriek of fasteners giving way, a series of impacts that grew progressively louder. Then came the hiss, that particular sound of pressurized gas escaping from a breached container. I could smell it, sharp and acrid, and I knew immediately that this was the moment. The disaster I'd been anticipating, the reason I'd spent weeks preparing when I could have been doing anything else. 3 boxcars, coupled together in a chain that had been slowly developing stress fractures from a warped rail line, derailed almost simultaneously about 200 yards from my position. The impact jarred the entire yard, and for a moment everything seemed to pause, as though the world was holding its breath. Then came the secondary event. The tanker car, the one with the slow gas leak that was now becoming a rapid one, began to rupture. People started screaming. The few residents of the yard who were out in the open scrambled toward shelter. Two families who'd been camped in the yard, people I hadn't even known were there, emerged from beneath improvised tents, looking around in disorientation and terror. And then came the fire. The rupturing gas met an ignition source, perhaps a spark from the metal-on-metal contact, perhaps something else entirely, but suddenly there was flame and heat and a wall of smoke that rose from the wreckage like something alive. In that moment, I understood why I had been abandoned. I understood why my daughter had thrown me out into the cold. I understood why I had been forced to learn survival in a way that people who had homes and families could never understand. Because sometimes the universe has a bitter sense of justice. Sometimes being thrown away is the only way to learn how to catch others as they fall. I opened my boxcar to everyone who needed it. Dennis came first, his cart struggling over the uneven ground. I helped him in, positioned him where the smoke was thinnest and the air was most breathable. Jasmine arrived with Marcus, both of them coughing. An elderly man I'd never seen before, someone who must have been newly arrived at the yard, stumbled toward my door. A woman with a small child, maybe 4 years old, her eyes wild with fear. They all came in, and my boxcar, the place that had been my tomb, my refuge, my shelter from the cruelty of the world, became something else. It became a sanctuary. The emergency services arrived within minutes of the fire being reported. Fire trucks, police cars, ambulances, all converging on the rail yard with sirens screaming. From my vantage point in the boxcar, I could see firefighters working to contain the fire, could see paramedics moving through the yard checking for injuries. I kept everyone in my boxcar calm, speaking quietly, drawing on the experience of countless nights in a hospital, countless moments of crisis managed through steady presence and clear thinking. The fire burned for hours. By the time it was fully contained, 3 boxcars were completely destroyed, the tanker car was a twisted wreck, and the rail line was damaged beyond immediate repair. The safety inspector who arrived late in the day with CSX management looked at the scene with the kind of expression that suggested someone had only narrowly avoided a catastrophic lawsuit. "This could have been so much worse," I heard him say to one of the officials. "If anyone had been in those cars when they derailed." He trailed off, but we both understood the implication. If the derailment had happened differently, if the gas rupture had followed a slightly different pattern, if anyone had been sleeping in those cars, there would have been deaths. Multiple deaths. A disaster that would have made national news and devastated a city. Instead, there were minor injuries, no deaths, and a situation that, while serious, had been contained and controlled. It was only after the emergency vehicles had left and the immediate danger had passed that people began to ask questions. How had those living in the yard known to gather in my boxcar before the derailment? Why had I, specifically, chosen that car as my shelter? Why had I reinforced it in ways that made it structural sound when everything around it was collapsing? By morning, the story had reached the local news. "Homeless woman in rail yard saves lives," the headline read in the Columbus Dispatch. There were interviews with the people I'd sheltered, all of them confirming that I had warned them, had prepared my boxcar, had opened it to anyone who needed safety. The fire department commended my actions. The city's homeless services coordinator issued a statement acknowledging that this crisis had exposed gaps in how the city responded to vulnerable populations. And somewhere, in a suburban house with a 2-car garage and a financial advisor, my daughter Sarah saw the story. 2 days after the derailment, Sarah came to the rail yard. She was alone, without Marcus, and she looked smaller than I remembered her, as though the weight of guilt was physically pressing down on her shoulders. I was sitting outside the boxcar, waiting to talk with city officials about a permanent shelter solution that was being discussed, and I saw her approaching. For a moment, neither of us spoke. There was too much between us, not just the months since she'd thrown me out, but the years before that, all the ways I'd been slowly invisible in our relationship, all the sacrifices I'd made without question or expectation of return. "Mom," she said, and her voice cracked on the single word. "I saw what you did. I saw that you saved people. I looked at her, this woman who was my daughter, and also a stranger, this person who had inherited my face and my stubbornness, but apparently not my capacity for grace. I didn't do anything heroic, I said quietly. I did what I would have done anywhere, in any situation. I used the skills I had and the knowledge I possessed, and I helped people. That's all any of us can do. I was so wrong, she said, and tears were streaming down her face now. I was so cruel and so wrong in you. You didn't even tell me what I did to you. You didn't make me feel guilty. I survived. I interrupted. That was my priority. Not your guilt, not your redemption, not your regret. Just survival. And I meant it. In those 3 months in the boxcar, in the process of being forced to rediscover myself without the role of mother or nurse or wife or caregiver, I had found something more valuable than any of those identities. I had found Margaret. Just Margaret. A woman with skills and intelligence and the capacity to solve problems. A woman who didn't need to be needed to have value. A woman who could stand alone in the cold and not break. Sarah tried to convince me to come back to the house, or rather, to the new apartment she and Marcus had rented. We have room, she said. We can make space for you. The least I owe you. You don't owe me anything, I said, and I meant this too. And that's why I'm not coming back. I'm not interested in debt or obligation or gratitude. I'm interested in building something new. Something where I'm not invisible, where my value isn't tied to what I do for you. By the end of April, the city of Columbus had converted an old community center near the rail yard into a permanent shelter facility. They'd hired me as a consultant on the design and then as a program coordinator, a position that actually paid enough to rent a small apartment. Jasmine got a job in the same facility, working as an office coordinator. Dennis was connected with a specialized facility that could better manage his medical needs. Marcus, the young man, enrolled in a job training program. The homeless population of the rail yard hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed from an invisible crisis into a visible community that was being actively supported rather than actively ignored. My daughter and I have found a careful equilibrium since then. She calls sometimes. I see her occasionally. We're learning to have a relationship that's based on something other than obligation or expectation, something slower and stranger, and perhaps more real than what we had before. Marcus apologized for his role in encouraging her to push me away. He and Sarah went to therapy. Their marriage is different now, shaped by the knowledge of what happens when you treat people as disposable. The boxcar still stands in the rail yard, though it's no longer used as shelter. The city designated it as a historical monument of sorts, a physical reminder of the disaster that almost happened, of the woman who saw it coming, of the moment when being invisible became a kind of armor. Cold doesn't harden people. It clarifies them. In the months after I left my daughter's house, in the days when I didn't know if I'd survive the night, in the hours when I was forced to depend only on my own skills and intelligence, I learned that I was stronger than I'd ever realized. I had always thought my strength came from my capacity to care for others, to put my own needs aside, to be the person who could be relied upon. But the real strength, the foundational strength, the kind that survives abandonment and cold and betrayal, that came from something deeper. It came from the simple, stubborn refusal to disappear. Would you have done what my daughter did? Would you have blamed an aging parent for the failures of your own choices? Would you have thrown them out into the cold rather than face the discomfort of having them in your space? I'm not asking these questions to judge you. I'm asking because I think about them myself, and because I believe that every one of us contains the capacity for both cruelty and grace, and the only thing that determines which one wins is the choices we make when we're tired and scared and desperate. I read every comment you leave. I see you. And maybe that's the ultimate moral of this story. In a world that's designed to make people invisible, the revolutionary act is simply to see them, to acknowledge their existence. To recognize that behind every statistic about homelessness, every story about abandonment, every tale of betrayal, there is a human being with skills and history and worth. My mother always said I wouldn't amount to much. She said I was too soft, too willing to sacrifice, too much of a dreamer to survive in the real world. When I sold my house to pay off my daughter's debts, she said I was throwing away my future. And when my daughter threw me out into the cold, I thought maybe she was right. But I wasn't destroyed. I was clarified. And now, looking back at everything that happened, I'm grateful for the cold. I'm grateful for the boxcar. I'm grateful for the moment when I was forced to find out who I was when nobody needed anything from me. If you're still listening to this story, if you've made it this far into the darkest parts of my journey, then you understand something essential about human nature. You understand that the people we're willing to discard are often the ones with the most to teach us. You understand that strength isn't always visible. You understand that sometimes the smallest, most invisible people are the ones holding the world together. I'm asking you to subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories because I have more stories like this. Stories of women who were dismissed and discarded, who found themselves in impossible situations, who discovered that the world is more unjust and more magical than we could ever imagine from our comfortable positions. Stories of survival and revenge not through violence or cruelty, but through the radical act of refusing to disappear. There are thousands of stories like mine waiting to be told. There are thousands of Margarets living in boxcars and shelters and parks across this country, people with skills and intelligence and value who've been made invisible by circumstance or choice or betrayal. Let's breathe life into those stories. Let's make sure they're heard. Let's build a world where being thrown away is not the end of your life, but the beginning of your real one. Subscribe to Olive Revenge Stories. Tell me your story in the comments. Help me reach 1,000 subscribers and prove to everyone who doubted us that these tales matter. Because they do. They matter more than anything.